Board games, board games, we might be talking about board games, but we're not gonna shout. We are going to be talking about this thing. It's going to be about games about which I'm not singing yet, but we're going to be talking about games with small footprints, and we'll talk about them and give you some hints of why you might want them and how to design these small footprint games which can turn out to be fine. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good whatever it is, wherever you are. 10 a.m. ish UK time. Time for Busy Beats and Board Game Blether. And today I have the pleasure of having Steve. Thank you for joining me.
Hello. Thank you for having
And
me on.
we were talking, we decided that we were going to talk about small footprints games. And um, this is somewhat inspired by your latest Kickstarter. And hello, Heather. It's lovely to see you this morning. I hope that you're generally well. And this it seems to be close to your hearts. Is it because in Australia people generally have smaller tables than the ginormous things that I hear people have in America?
I'm not sure if that's true, but it might be. I think Australians might be a little bit more casual, but we certainly have a lot of people who back huge Kickstarters here as well. So I think for me, it started out of necessity though. As a very small, very poor designer, the games that I could get published, the games that I can get out, have to be small.
Mm-mm-mm. And so it's more about the components count for you rather than necessarily the space that they take up on the table. But it sounds like getting small footprints on the table is a bonus.
Yeah. Look, a lot of the games I play are in pubs, and a lot of people. I live in central Sydney, and
Mm-mm.
a lot of us have very small houses these days. You know, a lot of my friends are they're renting. You know, we don't have a huge amount of space. I think the dining table in general is something that doesn't appear in a lot of people's houses uh, these days. You know, if you're renting, if you live in an apartment, you might not have a dining table. You might just have a coffee table. So it's definitely a thing where, oh look, we've just got a small table. We can't afford to
Mm-mm-mm.
bring one of these gargantuan table eating games. My friend has a couple of big Lacerda games, and he's like, no, can't bring that. Won't fit.
Yeah,
So
I
yeah,
guess
table real estate is an issue.
it's similar here in London. I mean, obviously, property prices in London are higher than the rest of the country, and this is the densest part. And Um, my table here, it's exactly this size, like the width and also the length. So,
Yeah,
yeah, that's correct. Um, and it's fine. Like you can have a game on it, you can play on it, you can have some cups around it. But as soon
yep.
as you bring out some snacks or have some meal, well, we've got to pause the game. I like some people talk about, oh, I don't want drinks and food to be on the same table. But for me, gaming is a social thing. Sure, I understand if you've got a trading card game or something where your game costs like hundreds or even thousands, you might be a wee bit more precious. But for me, that kind of ruins the joy of gaming where you can have people around and maybe a plate and be munching. And where I used to live, it was about 10 miles further north, and with a bunch of other people. We had a lovely big table and we could have little bowls of food while we were playing. But
Yep.
here, as soon as you've got four people sitting around, I mean, it's game or food. Even with this, yeah, you don't get much choice. Um, and Chris says small amuse-bouche games are a necessity.
Yeah.
100%. Now, before we get into the main topic, I thought we'd spend maybe 2, 3 minutes chatting about our Recent highlights, living life and seeing the sights. Recent highlights, playing games and other delights. Recent highlights. And as always, anyone watching, please feel free to chime in with anything that you've enjoyed yourselves or any news that you feel is worth sharing. I mean, of course, the Cardboard Edison finalists are announced, and congratulations to all the people who frankly even entered. I think that sometimes with these kinds of things, it's tempting to just say congratulations to the finalists, congratulations to the winner, but just getting your game together in good faith and making everything and being open and listening to the feedback, I think is an achievement. Have you looked at this at all?
I have had a brief look at the finalists. I always do. It's always really impressive. But I also made that exact same comment, I think, on the Board Game Design Lab page, that if you have made your game into a state that you feel you can show it off, you've made a good video, and you're ready to get that into the Cardboard Edison, that's a huge achievement. Look, and I'm hearing a lot of my friends talking about, oh, I got some really good feedback, or I got this, and and so just the ability to get really solid feedback is also just a huge deal. It's so important to making your game even better. And it also it should also be. I mean, they do pick very good games, but there's also sometimes a game that just can't quite fit with their audience or their judges, and you might just miss out. And it doesn't mean your game is much worse, or you should give up or anything like that. It's always a really
100%.
strong crowd, and
of
everyone
course,
should be congratulated.
a quick hello to Timmy. And of course, if you didn't make it to as a finalist, or regardless, there's obviously so many other contests going on. And if that's something that you think will, whether it's the motivation or the feedback or whatever your reason for entering, do please enter. And I'm going to also plug in my own LDEC design contest with a closing date of 31st of July, the day before 1st of August. But in personal news, I had a lovely chat with Kirsten Lunde last night, which is all about Questable. We've been excited that some people have really been enjoying the game. We were excited to brainstorm through some new level ideas because the core rules of the game are done, but we've got so much more to examine in terms of the level design. And that was probably my biggest highlight. The other thing I'm going to say is I won on Board Game Arena the Nobel Prize achievement, where you've played as many games as are officially released. So
wow.
I've got 520 something games played, and I think 72 unplayed. But because there's that, because I'd played a bunch of things that were in beta or in alpha, those count against the total that you have to play. I think it's not super clear from the award descriptions, but yeah, we think that's what's going on. And so I'm planning to get it down until I've played literally all of them. And there's a lot of trick-taking games, probably more that those are the ones that I'm least excited about, to be honest, as a player. But there's definitely been a few where I've been like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I'm learning about the user interface. And if I want to get a digital adaptation of one of my new games, I'll be very well placed to know what works well and what doesn't. Honestly, I've been learning more about the user interface than the games themselves necessarily. Have you played much on Board Game Arena?
On and off. I used to play on it a fair bit when I first moved down. I used to live in Brisbane. When I moved to Sydney and all my friends were back in Brisbane, I played on it quite a bit then. But yeah, then I used to sort of play a lot of Tabletop Simulator as well. So, but Board Game Arena's got better and better. They're more and more. It's more graphic, so it's actually easier to use now. And yeah, certainly a lot of my friends play on it. So I dabble.
Now,
Yeah.
what are some of your recent highlights? I mean, I hear that you launched a Kickstarter. Is that right?
Yes, I launched a Kickstarter an hour ago, so it's been a big day. that's been very exciting. I've also been doing a lot of interviews and a lot of press for it, gathering everything for that, and that's been really exciting as well. Just it's been very gratifying that everywhere we take the game, people are reacting really strongly to it, and just having a great time. What is that image? I don't know what that image is that Dalek just posted. Something on a stick.
Hello.
Yeah, so that was my day today, was doing one more interview, getting interviews ready, making sure everything on the Kickstarter was right. This is the first time we've ever got promotion on the Dice Tower. So all the Americans are asleep now, but we're hoping soon they'll wake up and see the Dice Tower video and be interested in backing this project. It's so that's really exciting.
Was that a paid preview, or was that them covering the Kickstarter campaign because you sent a press release? What happened there?
Yeah, so mostly if you want reviews from them, you have to pay for coverage. In some cases, they'll pick up big games, but we paid for a video with one of the Australians on the channel, Stella and Tarrant, who we've met a few times, and they're lovely, and that way we get the game to them quicker. They did a video for us, and that's a paid. It's also a paid rules teach as well. We wanted to make sure that people really understood how the game worked, so that was important.
Oh, fantastic! And so this is, if you give a very quick, 30-second summary, it's heist, it's a role playing. What's going on here?
It's a very sort of hard to define game, because it's a lot like a role-playing game, but it doesn't feel like any role-playing game you've ever played before. It's a little bit like if you played Once Upon a Time or Fiasco or maybe For the Queen. It's basically what we call a prompt game. So there's only 18 cards in the deck. Each card represents a thing you might do in a heist, and the cards are shuffled together, and when they come out, your power gets activated, and you get to describe a cool scene in a heist. And in this way, by sort of the way that the cards are randomly broken up into the 5 acts and whose cards get drawn when, you get a story that's different every single time you play. And it really does only take 18 cards and just 18 minutes, which we think is really different. It's a role-playing game, it's a storytelling game, but it doesn't take the whole evening, and it doesn't take a huge big set of books or anything like that. You don't need a huge character sheet. You can jump in, and particularly if you've never played an RPG, or if you've bounced off an RPG, you thought that's not for me, then we think you might like it.
Condensed into 18 minutes.
Exactly. So you can give it a try. As I said to some people last night, I said, do you want to play this? And so they said, well, how long is that? So it's about 15 to 20 minutes. I went, yeah, sure. Most people are going to be fine to try something for 15 to 20 minutes. So it's a really good way to try out role-playing and get a very different experience than you might from playing a 4-hour game of Dungeons and Dragons.
For sure. And I've noticed that it's a lot easier to playtest things the shorter they are. Because,
that's true.
I mean, in a place, if you've got an hour or an hour and a half, well, you could either playtest a small part of a much longer thing, or, if your game fits into there, then happy days. Or if you've got a tiny little thing, well, you can play it again and again. You can iterate on it. You can, start studying, okay, that's worked out that way, but what if they play it twice in a row? Does it still work? And really nail down into that feedback and really drill down.
That's absolutely true.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you do have a great vision for a great, 12-hour game, I'm not saying don't do it, but it's going to be harder to play test. You just got to realize that.
Similar
thing. It might take you longer, therefore, to get it working.
With big player counts games, for example, I've been lucky enough to have a game accepted by Now Play This, but I know that they want my game to be playable for 15 to 20 people, and at least 12 minimum. And the most I've play tested it with so far is 8, and I told them, well, worst case scenario, if it doesn't I'll try and test it at least once, and if it doesn't work, then we can split into two groups if there's too many people. But even getting like 12 people together it's a big ask to say, hey, everyone, play test this game. And so I'll see if I can coerce some people at, Aircon to come together. We'll see how it goes. But that's a challenge that I need to overcome. Now,
Yes.
talking about a game, and obviously there's lots of excitement, but is there something that you'd like to share as a brilliant thing? Brilliant thing? What's a little thing which is brilliant?
I saw a dog on the bus today, so
Wow.
that's always just a joy for me.
Pets on public transport.
Yep, we're really trying to change the culture in Australia. They're sort of not allowed on trains, probably, but no one's quite sure. But they are allowed on buses now. And this woman was taking her dog to work, which is also a new thing that lots of workplaces
they've
are
got
doing.
to be behaved, of course.
That's right. And it was a very good dog, sitting in its bag, being a good girl. And that just cheered me up on my way to work. I actually work with dogs in my day job as well. But there was another dog, and I thought that was just a very good sign of a good day, a good dog, and a good day.
That's a lovely sentiment. And when I was going to Essex on Saturday with a friend, we did spy a couple of dogs, one on the underground, one on the bigger train, let's say. And it's like, oh, those two dogs look so similar. And it is just joyous to see these things. As long as they're well behaved, why not? It's all got to be contextual. I mean, in the same way that humans are allowed on buses and public transport, but if a human was being, bothersome, like then you eject that particular human. It doesn't mean to say eject all humans. You just say, well, that human's being verbally abusive or shouting a lot, or if a human started biting other people. But it's the same with pets.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And good morning, Sate, and good morning, Black Sheep. I hope that you are both generally well. So let's move on to the main topic. As always, please do comment, ask questions from like follow. So talking about brilliant things, we've talked about the utility value of small footprint games, that they can fit on the table. Not everyone has this ginormous thing. Are there other advantages? I guess keeping your plates and game slightly separate.
Yeah. There's also portability. These days, these games like that they're on Kickstarter and they weigh a ton. I have some friends who come to gaming club on bikes, and they just can't bring many games, because they're just too big. Last night, I was actually at an event. We were playing Merchant's Cove, and we had the core set, and it's got like 7 different modules or something. And it was just a lot of stuff. So there was the physical time. It took longer to set up. It took longer for everyone to learn the rules because everyone had all these little bits that they had to unpack. So, we're time poor, we're space poor. Nobody wants to carry a huge weight everywhere. So there's lots of things that you can, lots of benefits to small games, definitely.
Yeah, because small footprint games, they tend to be a little bit lower on resources. But having said that, when we talk about small footprint games, there is also the other way to go. You could have something in a big tower. For example, I've played like a physical form of 3D Noughts and Crosses where the footprints was this, but then it went up to here. Or conversely, a lot of the Connect 4 style things where it's balanced vertically. I mean, I'm not such a fan of Connect 4, but shout out to Connect 4 Spin, which is actually a good game in my opinion. But you've got this elevation that's more meaningful than just a giant miniature. How do you feel about those?
Oh, look, I think that's something that we could really explore. Like, we could start designing games that fit the small spaces that we often have, and also you could maybe design a game that could be played at multiple levels, so that the adults play at one level and the kids play at a level below, and they're working together somehow. Like I remember there was an old Star Wars game where you were sort of fighting on multiple levels because it was the first movie and you were fighting on the planet and also in space or something. And yeah, like I'm sure there's ways that we could use vertical space, and I don't think anyone's sort of tapped into it now. There's Everdell, of course, that had the tree, but it's just usually just a block in the middle of the table. Sometimes it just doesn't even do anything. It's just like, here's a huge thing. The tower, what's it called? Return to Dark Tower. That's got a big tower in it, but you still have the huge board spreading out. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see that. Like, I'm always interested to see people look at the reality and go, how are people playing games? What can we do with that space? We used to have really big Jenga sets as well. At some of the events we would go to.
Although, having said that, if you're playing Jenga and then you've got cups and stuff around it,
yes.
That's probably not the best idea because they're going to be knocked over. But I mean, this photo by Bogavante Johnson of Holly, which is another game that's played on multiple levels.
Yeah.
And Holly isn't one that I've played myself, but it seems really fascinating, the idea of having all this strategy rather than just expand it widthways. That can fit onto a small coffee table, as you put it.
Yeah. There was a great card game on Kickstarter a couple of years ago called Palm Island that you can play in your hand. That's something I've always wanted to nail down, as well as get a game that plays just in your hands. When I was a kid, of course, when I was at university, we would play cards everywhere. So we would sort of start in the cafeteria, and then we'd walk out and sit at our class and play on a little, tiny desk. Then we'd play, sitting on the grass, and we just play cards everywhere. So a deck of cards, hard to lose in those cases, and you just need a tiny little bit of space. Yes, they could blow away.
I think there's definitely something lovely here, and I think that there is a lot of untapped space of games that just use the palm. And I worked on Portable, which started off as, hey, here's an LDEC game and I'm in the bus. Oh, there's nothing that I can play. How about this? And when you're traveling, this is something that you can still play, because sure, there's been times when I've been on a train and I've had a little table, which is literally maybe 120% the size of a laptop. So they are teeny tiny desks on a train. Sometimes they're not even that big. But you've got enough space to place maybe 9 cards, 6 cards, and that gets you a little bit of a game going depending on what's happening. But then if you're actually just able to play in your hand, then even better. And you could play that whilst in a queue or on a bus where you don't have any table in front of you. I mean, there's so many situations where you might want to just bring it out and be boom. Now,
yeah, absolutely.
What's the core restrictions? Because and Black Sheep says virtual bits can sometimes get in the way from seeing what's happening, like the so you mean elevated bits, like the tower in the Dark Tower can get in the way from seeing what's behind it. Yeah, I totally get that, and I get that there might be an accessibility issue with, you need to look around and see what's going on in this elevation. But here, I think it's not as bad because you've got all the gaps, maybe.
I think it's an interesting design challenge to try and make it pro-social rather than anti-social, to make it something that you want to look around and peek through. And maybe the key is to make it a connecting game where you're trying to see people through it, and concentrate on what you can see as opposed to what's blocking. That could be really interesting.
And the other thing, I guess, is that in this game, or indeed in 3D Noughts and Crosses or Connect 4, the focus is on that bit. Whereas if you turn to Dark Tower, I mean, it feels like, sure, the tower is there, sure, it's a presence, but the presence is just one of looming anticipation, where occasionally it's going to spit out skulls all over. And it's really the effects of the Dark Tower rather than what's going on the Dark Tower itself that has the gravitas.
Yep.
So you might argue that, yes, there's a great play experience, but you could. I'm not committed to this argument, but you could argue for sure that it's kind of like wasted footprints, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Be interested to see someone do sort of, even though like I don't know how you do this, but going down the other way on the bottom of the table. But of course, everything's about table presence, so then it wouldn't look visible, and Kickstarter wouldn't be able to show it off. And that's, I think, the other side of this is that everything is about catching people's eye in an era where, you know, people are trying to catch everyone's attention. And if it's a big thing that sits on a table and it looks big, it'll catch someone's eye at a convention, or the Kickstarter will look impressive and people will pay more money and so on.
And for sure, like I've had pitches with publishers where they've told me, "Oh, we like all your games, but we want a game that we can sell at $20, 25 minimum. We don't want to have anything that goes below that. So whilst we like party games, we aren't going to have cards-only party games. And we really want something with a bit more table presence." And that normally equates to big bits. And at the risk of endlessly blowing my own trumpet, I do think that Yogi is really good at attracting attention, because if you've got a bunch of people doing that and then you walk past, you're going to go, "Oh, what's going on?" And I like the fact that it turns the players into the spectacle. The other thing that I feel is that Rhino, Super Rhino, Rhino Hero, whatever it's called, depending on the territory where you are, that's a game which is super cheap to make. It's just cards, and you build it up, and because it's just cards, sure, they might fall into your soup or into your food if, you know, there's nothing on top of it, but it's not going to knock over your glasses when those cards fall over. And there's still this strong table presence of, oh, big tall thing. Elevation really brings in the spectacle. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it also brings in people's attention. Like in Rhino Hero, and Jenga and everything, you're always watching, and that connects you. You can't sit back. There's also
attention.
There's a great game called Monara, which is the only collaborative tower building game I know of, which I just love, because it's got that same whoa of Jenga, but also you're all working together to keep the tower up, which is just fascinating. And I think there's a lot to be. It creates very much a central focus and a central tension, and I'm sure we can do more with that.
Now, one easy way to make games have a smaller footprint would be to just shrink it all down and to say, okay, here's a travel size version of this. Okay, we'll shrink the board, shrink the cards, make them, this size rather than this size. Like all that. How do you feel about that? Is that something that we should be doing more as an industry, offering travel versions of games by default? Once
it's
it
interesting.
reaches a point where it's economically viable to do so, of course.
I'd be interested to sort of look at the math of that. I mean, as a kid, we had Travel Cluedo, Travel Settlers. My parents just generally bought the travel version because it took up less space in the house, and we also traveled a lot. But of course, something like Cluedo sells a lot of copies, so they can afford to go, how do we miniaturize that? So, mini Scrabble, things like that. It would be interesting. But a lot of games, if they have enough money, they go and make a digital version. So that's another way to sort of be traveling. Maybe that's where the travel sort of thing has gone. But
obviously, I've played a lot of Board Game Arena. There's no denying that the human-to-human connection is not the same over a digital game compared to playing it on the table. And there is a big difference between me having to look at this screen, which is about this big, compared to being able to look on the table and see this. I mean, Carcassonne isn't a great small footprint game or Bandido, but one of those games are troublesome, let's say, to
Mm.
play on in a
Yeah.
digital implementation, and you're potentially passing this tiny phone around. You don't get to look at your friends.
I think Carcassonne was a great example of a game that could be made smaller, and made into a travel version and or a magnetic version. You know, playing on a magnetic board or on your fridge. And yeah, maybe that's something that the successful games, the games that do really well. Hello, Dutch Yoda and everyone. Um, yeah, I think it would be great to see a game that's really successful. To go, okay, we're going to do a travel version.
Because
Let's have a
quite
travel version.
often they make the giant deluxe version. I mean, like Azul when they did that briefcase,
Yep.
and this is almost like something that, hey, you can imagine if you had this. This is something aspirational for you to want, for you to desire, and it feeds
Yep.
into the whole, oh wow. And the truth is, that would be kind of fun to play, but it's something that maybe I check it out at a board game cafe and I go, oh yeah, that's quite cool to see. And then I touch it and I feel satisfied. And that's the joy that I get. It feels like a good thing for a board game cafe, but not something for me. Or even though I'm super into games and I actually genuinely love Azul, and I feel like I love Hive, but and I'd played it 40, 50 times digitally before I bought my first copy. And I went for Hive Pocket, and I'm not going to lie, parts of that was because it was 30% cheaper, but parts of that was also, well, it's smaller. You get to play it even on a tiny table when you're at a cafe and there's two people here and you've got to share a table with strangers. You can still play this two-player game and it's all good. You don't have to feel embarrassed about taking up more of the table than you ought to.
Absolutely, yeah. Hive is
So,
a classic example of of a good thing to make a travel game for. Games like that, and Azul, like there should be a travel Azul. That we shouldn't have gone up in size. We should have gone down. But
mm-mm-mm.
there's as you say, it's aspirational. There's people out there who go, well, I want to show off to my friends. That's why I'm buying board games, really, to establish a kind of social credit, and that's also great. You know, people. It's nice to have nice, big, chunky things to show off and have experiences with that. Um, but it's also nice to have something small,
Mm-mm.
that you can take anywhere and show off to more and more people.
And Mike says that they have extra large copies of Ticket to Ride and Takenoko.
Yep.
And I mean, if it brings you lots of joy, then great for you. But I do agree that for people who really love these games, I mean, again, that's part of why I think that the city maps are a better introduction than the country maps, if you know what I mean, for Ticket to Ride.
Mm.
So, or continent maps in the case of Ticket to Ride, well, Europe or Asia. But yeah, when you've got Ticket to Ride New York and then you play it on this tiny board, and yes, it's faster, but it's also just taking up such a smaller space. I mean, we could literally on Tuesday play that and then got out some burgers and, eating with one hand, playing with the other hand. Standard rules, don't eat and
Yep.
play with the same greasy hand. But you carry on and it's just such a joy. And I
Mm.
think that's important to be able to say, hey, we've got this tiny space. But when we talk about portability, I guess there's also the idea of resilience, isn't there? Because something like Bakelite or plastic, which can suffer a bit of beer spilled on it or even a bit of food. I
Mm.
mean, again, Yogi, whilst the rules are 98% the same as in a bind, it's better because you can literally douse it in beer and it'll be fine. You can just
Yep.
rinse it all off. And similarly, Hive that we've been talking about, you can just wash that all off. There's nothing in there that, except for the actual paper rules, I guess, that will suffer if you put it through the washing machine.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's yeah. I was actually there's been a seminar convention online in the last week about toy makers and game makers, which has had a lot of speakers at it, and some of the speakers were designers and creators from the toy market, and they were talking about making things toyetic, and that means things that sell well as toys. If they might be a game or have a game element, but we talked about Connect 4. It's made out of solid plastic, and you can't break it. It's so anyone over the age of 3 can have a copy, and there's probably like people out there who have their Connect 4 or their travel Connect 4 that they had when they were kids. And yeah, let's see. Would love to see more of that. Like if you had a Ticket to Ride that's made out of smaller things or crunchier things, so that just that lasts. Obviously, cardboard lasts pretty well anyway, but plastic is better. Oh, not that we want to destroy the environment.
Yeah, and then it makes me think, well, maybe they could be made out of, wooden chips or something. But yeah, that's maybe a separate argument. Let's not get too deep into the washable, indestructible line. But talking about shrinking down stuff, there is an accessibility issue, right? Because at a certain point, I mean, for sure, at a certain level, everyone would have to start using tweezers for these components.
Yes.
I've seen people make replicas of board games for dolls' houses, which is quite amazing. Like just tiny little things that they glue together. But in a more practical scale, I mean, if a chip, when you've got dice that are 10 millimeters rather than dice that are 30 millimeters, you'll see people that struggle to use them. They might bounce differently. It might become so where do you draw that line if you are deciding to make a travel version of the game?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm sure people have mobility issues and the physical dexterity issues. That's definitely a difficult thing. But I think I don't think we have to be all of one. I think like magnetics, for example, will help with that, holding things in one place, and designing for it. Maybe that's the other thing is like, what can we do to design to put a lot of punch into a single package? Can we make our components things that shrink? Azul's very simple because it's just color, right? It's just colored tiles, so that's something that can be smaller. And we've designed these games that are just cards, and you could make the cards a little bit smaller. They're probably about as small as they can go, but they'd be because then the readable issues come in. But you could always go down 1/2 size as well, so that you can think about. Yeah, I guess the key is like, how can we communicate as much information as possible in the simplest way, so that we can reduce footprints. And that could be environmental footprints as well, yeah.
What you talked about, readability, is a really interesting one. And I think that this can be baked into the design of the game, thinking, how am I going to use fewer words here? How do we need to use this effect? I mean, in a lot of, I'm going to say that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a prime example of where the text size is kind of minuscule. And you look at those cards, even though they're full-size cards, okay. And I watched a video of Yu-Gi-Oh! Players chatting to other TCG players, and they said, yeah, honestly, we don't normally read the cards. We read them once, and then we kind of memorize. And that's not accessible at all.
No,
but obviously, in a certain design point of view, if your game needs to have these big elaborate effects, then okay, that's your game. But maybe ask yourself, does your game need to have these big elaborate effects? Could they be simpler? Could they be something that's evoked or communicated more effectively using just like 4 words or a couple of symbols? Could you simplify things? And could we bake things into it so that the components can be smaller and still give you the information that you require? Looking at Magic the Gathering cards from Alpha, where for the most part the text size was fine, but then once in a while it's like, yeah, I want to write 3 paragraphs of text and I'm not going to hold back, so I'm just going to shrink it down to font size 6. I might be slightly exaggerating, but not that much. And yeah, so as designers, do you think it's important to be mindful of um, simplifying in order to be able to reduce the size of components? Or do you
Yeah,
think that we're
absolutely.
at risk of giving up something if we say no to this sorts of complexity?
I think the thing that springs to my mind is the fact that a lot of games are designed um, for the European market and are trying to be they aim to be language independent. That's why board games use so many symbols and things like that, because the old days, something like Rio Grande would put out a game, they'd have to do 6 different languages, and they didn't want to have to translate every card. So you would design a game that didn't need a lot of text, and that's a lot of the classic Euros. There's very little text on the cards, if any at all. It's and designers were aware of that, and they designed to it. I think there's always room. Someone's always going to be like, well, we could design, we don't, we might be miss out on some other idea, but we're not exactly, going to stop making those games. We can just keep these things in mind. We're always actually considering restrictions. When I'm thinking about a game, I'm thinking about, well, can I physically create that as a prototype? I don't have a lot of, skills in terms of like 3D modeling or something like that. So it's harder for me to build a toy. I don't have, and I have to think about what's going to be able to sell as well. So whenever we're thinking about, games, we have to think about all these kind of things. As you said before, you probably wouldn't go to, Hasbro or ELO with a game that needed 12 people, because they'd go, well, nobody's going to buy that. So we can also go.
Whereas
If we,
a festival where
yeah,
they're going to organize events is the perfect place for it.
that's right. Yeah, and sure, and there's also perfect places then for a big game like Gloomhaven or Descent or something. Then that's Kickstarter's meant for that, because that's where people have lots of money. And the important thing though is, as gamers, is to play lots of things, to not just go to a club and go, well, we only want to see what's cool on Kickstarter. We also want to play Bob's game that he found on the internet or something, or a party game that the rules only exist on somebody's website or someone invented on Twitter one day. I actually post a lot of micro games on my Twitter feed, and some of them are just jokes or art pieces, but some of them are designed to be played, and some of them have been very successful. So, I just say I try to fit all the rules into a single tweet, and it's enough. So there's other ways to get a game instead of just the hottest thing off Kickstarter, and
Yeah, I
that's
think
where we
that
can
the
find.
key
So I go,
thing
yep,
is that we don't. It's not about saying no, we can't have this. We can still have games with high player counts, or high word counts, I should say. I mean, it's like when we talk about diversity. No one's saying let's ban all white men from gaming. No one's saying that. What
yep,
we are saying is let's have more women, let's have more black people, let's have more people of color. It's like let's have more of everything. And
yes,
it's not as well. I mean, in one sense, honestly, it is kind of a zero sum game. Like, it is kind of a thing where you say, yeah, in a typical game, rather than having 90 to 100% white men, let's have it be like 45%, something like that would be nicer
yeah,
as an
yeah,
average. And then, actually, white men shouldn't be 45% representation as an average. That would still be a bit low if, then you've got ethnic minorities. Anyway, I don't want to give an exact number, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean. Yep.
But we can still have a few games where this is focusing on the history of these individuals. There's nothing wrong with saying, okay, we're going to focus on Einstein or whatever, but like Tory Brown, who made Votes for Women and games about suffragettes, it's about more options, and restrictions do breed creativity. So by the same
Perhaps to do.
token, we're not saying let's ban all games with high word counts. But I do think that restrictions breed creativity, and I think there's a lot that you can do in having relatively few words and being unfettered, uninhibited, unrestrained. It just means that you do what comes naturally to you and easily. It means that you don't analyze things. It means you don't think deeply about things. It doesn't mean that you magically do things better because you've got no restraint. It means that you do things without forethought. It means that your things, if anything, are going to turn out worse. That's my opinion.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's sort of really a part of building good storytelling games is also, giving people constraints, and that helps them build. And that's something we do a lot when we build role playing games. Is uh, is building constraints, because that helps people be creative. And yeah, I'd love to see just people explore this. I mean, Button Shy made a whole business out of tiny games. I'd love to see some competitions or some companies go, our games are small, or they're enduring, or they're all environmentally sourced, or they're all made out of fabric, or something like that.
Yeah, like Mike mentioned, fabric could have been used for the Azul bits, and I think there's Marrakesh. I can't remember the name of the game by Gigamik where you move the little person and there's those little fabric bits.
There's that game about weaving too, which has fabric in it, but it's also quite a small game, but that's very lovely, and people really respond to that. I mean, Calico's got a lot of cardboard in it, but it's also quite small, and it's also very intimate, and people respond to that as well. So we know that there's a market for these kind of things, and I think it's a really good idea, especially when we're talking about catching people's attention. Thinking outside the box in terms of what might catch people's attention is like, well, it doesn't have to be big and chunky. It can be small and beautiful, or it can be resilient and beautiful, or whatever it is. So yeah.
And I think before we start wrapping up, I mean, from a design point of view, yes, we've talked a lot about reducing the size of things, but it's also potentially about reducing the number of components on the table, maybe reusing stuff, maybe rather than everyone having their own player board with this and that and the other thing, can some of this be shifted onto a central board to reduce the amount of space it takes overall? Because if you say, hey, this is fine at 2 players, but if we want to play it at 4 players, no, it can't fit on the table, that's a bit sad.
Yeah. And we wouldn't want to be, we'd like to be more approachable and accessible in that sense by getting how do we get more people around the table? That's really what games is about, getting as many people playing as possible.
But as you say, when there's a small number of cards, I mean, by its very nature, you're not going to get to a button shy game that takes over your table. You're not going to get to a button shy game that you need a ridiculous amount of space to make. And when you look at the score, the fact that there are limited cards and the fact that there's a lot of these cards are, I think, being held in your hand, that's not even on the table. So that means that these cards are things that you examine and then you put it down maybe while your hands get tired. You know what I mean. But it's going to be a very small space.
It's a game that really doesn't take up a lot of space, and we designed it to put a lot of punch in. It also has a lot of replayability, and we've tried to include as many different options in the setup as well. If you look there's a video on our site by Richard Genders, and he just spends about 5 minutes talking about all the options. So now, that's really good.
We've talked about a lot. Is there anything else you would like to say on this topic? If someone's thinking, you know what, my game seems to be a bit sprawling. My game seems to be. I'm concerned that there's too much taking over the table here. Would you have any tips to those designers, or alternatively, do you want to make one last rant as your manifesto for small footprint games?
I think the key is thinking about physicality. You know, not just rules and not just good art or something. Think about, well, could this card be smaller? You know, is there a way that we can make the board more modular? That's the thing. If there's a modular design and your table's small, you can put a little bit of the board over there, or a bit of the board over there, or something. You know, or thinking about the physicality of your product is a really good idea as part of design. And when you're play testing, let people set your game up, right, to see how they interact with the space, and try to test it everywhere you can. You know, if you take it to a convention, take it, go where there's not, go to the eating area and see if you can play it on the small tables. Go to people's houses who live in small plate houses. You know, think about that, and you know, see if you can think about what ways there are to cut down, and just experiment. You also made me think of back in the day. There was about 20 years ago when cheap ass games first came out. They deliberately didn't have anything in your games that you needed, just the bare essentials. And they were like, you go and get counters from your other games, or from the mantelpiece or something, or bits of lint, or bottle top lids, and you probably own dice, and you probably own money. But then after a while, they put out a set of, here's just a big set of components. And I think just as we have companies that make, you know, really nice poker chips and things like that, there's probably someone out there who can just go, oh, actually, there was a Kickstarter last week from Atkin Games, which was about just little sets of your pieces in yellow or your whatever color. You could back any of these colors. So you could just go, you know, and if we built up a culture where people just go, I actually have a set which has all the money in it, for example, I can play any game that uses money, you know, or something like that. Then we could just go, okay, then this game's coming out without money, you know, or something like that. We could make a few assumptions like that. Obviously, we have a very diverse audience, but I think we all know we have cupboards full of stuff. I'd love to see people exploring that and just going, we have only included the very things, the base things you need, because we know you own lots of stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, I mean, that feels like a slightly separate topic about reusing the components compared to the small footprints. But on Saturday, when I tested my game, it's currently called A Game About Auctioning Cubes after winning an auction to become the auctioneer. So the clever thing is that there's 2 levels of auction, and then the auctioneer also takes the money. So it's like, but I ask people, you know, you've all got a bunch of cubes. All you need for this game is 3 shades of cubes. It doesn't matter what they are. If you've got yellow, blue, black, that'll work. If you've got green, pink, and orange, that'll work. As long as it's 3 types of cubes, that's all you need. And everyone at the table needs to be able to discern them. But presumably, you've got, you know, 3 cubes, and I think you needed about 15 of each. That's not a big ask. And then I asked people at the table, how would you feel about this if I sold it at a cheaper price and without cubes? And would you buy it? And I give people the thumb rating. So this means definitely yes, this means yes. And then I actually wish that I'd had the thing so I could give you the exact stats, because there were 6 people around the table. So it wasn't statistically relevant, but it was still a kind of, for me, it represented gamers. There was a decent sample size. I mean, and the rough thing was like, I don't know, because I like it and I like it enough to buy it, but I don't know if I would want to go to the hassle of taking the cubes out of my other game and putting them into this game. I just want to think, oh, I'm going out somewhere, I'll grab that game and go out with it. That's what people want. And that's slightly sad. But
it is. Yeah. part of it. That's part of approachability, really, I guess, which comes back to it, is that we don't want to have to think too much about what do we have to pack. We want to go, it's all in here. So there's always going to be trade-offs.
That's very true. It is all a question of what are we willing to prioritize. And for me, I mean, for that game, I will probably still be releasing it in that way because it's just, and yeah, it'll be a busy bargain bag. So it'll be at a ridiculously good price when people buy it at the convention.
Yep.
It'll be like $5, and then I'll expect to honestly sell out by the end of UK Games Expo, fingers crossed. And if I don't, then I'll consider it a failed experiment. But thankfully, because of the price of printing a small bunch of cards in literally just a bag, it's not going to cripple me financially. It's not like that big a thing. And I am at a position where I can use a big convention like UK Games Expo to sort of test the market. But we've talked a lot. I've asked you lots of questions. Is there a question that you would like to ask me as the question of the day? Question of the day. Here's a little question before we go on our way. A little question for me and potentially anyone who's watching.
Let me think. Do you have a pet, or what was your first pet? And did you ever take them on the bus?
I do not currently have a pet. I've never had a pet with legs. No, actually, that's not true. I had a pet spider for a short while, but it was basically just a spider that I found somewhere, and then it died very quickly because I knew nothing about taking care of spiders or anything. And yeah, I mean, in retrospect, it feels kind of inhumane. I just kind of put the spider into a little box and put things in front of it and assumed that it would be okay. But yeah. Mike says, I have a snake called Noodle. Cool.
Ooh.
Would you ever take, and he's been in the car when moving home. Would you take Noodle out with you? I mean, it feels a bit weird, but I mean, it's not exactly a creature that needs to get air, and presumably in the terrarium they need to have a certain temperature maintained. But yeah, I can just imagine you wandering around with this snake wrapped around your neck, and people going, "Oh, that's a bit odd." If I had, I honestly, it would depend entirely on the pet that I had. If I had a pet, what I would do. How about you? Do you have a pet? Anyone watching? How about you, Steve? Do you have a pet?
I don't actually. I live in, speaking of small spaces, I live in a place where we just can't have them. It's a boarding house. So, but I'm a dog trainer, an animal trainer. So I see lots of dogs all day at my job, my non-game design job.
Lovely. Well, at this point, I want to ask everyone, over to you, what's it up to you, can share button if you want to. Is there something that you need to do, something that you want to do? Please do share. I promise that I care. Myself, I'm going to be having a friend coming over. We might be wandering down to the Rose Garden. We might be going up to the hill and looking over the Thames. We'll definitely be spending a bit of time while she does her homework, and I maybe crack on with tidying or doing some of the art and final letter shapes for categorical. So that's what I'll be doing, and also potentially preparing for tomorrow and a few upcoming conventions. How about you? I mean, I imagine, are you doing more exposure stuff for your Kickstarter?
Yeah, I have a meeting, another interview tomorrow morning. So in about 12 hours. So I'll be pretty much falling asleep, hopefully, straight after this, because it's 10 p.m. here, and then I'll be getting up and doing another interview at 10 a.m. So hopefully that'll be good, and hopefully we'll be on our way to being funded. So we'll just have to see. And then trying to take it easy because it's been a busy week.
I mean, getting everything ready for a Kickstarter is always challenging, I guess. And I think that if anyone wants to check, well, firstly, let's recap and wrap up before we finish up. So we introduced the topic. We talked about the Cardboard Edison Awards and the Board Game Arena achievements, which say the community manager says that the hypothesis was correct, that indeed it was because the number of played games needs to equal the number of released games. And so if you've played extra alpha or beta, then those count against it. We talked about getting a bit of exposure by doing preview tutorial videos with Stella and Terrence. We talked about dogs on buses. We talked about the nature of time and
Yes.
3D elevation, whether that's Holly or 3D Knots and Crosses or Connect for Spin. We talked about spectacle and turning the people into the spectacle rather than needing these big miniatures. Like in Yogi, or having cards, just elevated and being a meaningful part of the gameplay in Rhino Hero. And Minara, which I don't know, but I will definitely check out. We talked about pocket versions of games, Hive Pocket, or indeed Travel, Magnetism. We talked about Azul. I mean, which you argued should not have gone big, should have gone smaller. We talked about indestructible, washable stuff. We talked about and the nature of what is really toyetic and feels good to the touch. We talked about the accessibility and dexterity challenges that might be prevalent if you go a little bit too far. But then again, you might go the other way, and by reducing the size, you might find yourself improving the accessibility by being more mindful of the word count and the general readability. Because, yes, you need to think about what sells, but restrictions breed consideration and thoughtfulness, and yes, creativity. It's not about restrictions hampering you. Yes, you could reuse components rather than everyone having their own individual stuff, having it in the middle, thinking about the physicality and test it physically, make sure that it works rather than it's always being played on, a virtual playtesting network, however that is, which I think is a possibly dangerous trend. I think that it is important to have people play it physically, not just to gauge the experience, but also to gauge how it sits on the table. Let other people set it up. That's a great tip. Test it everywhere. In the food stalls, if you're at a convention, and we talked about reusing your own components, not just within the game, but from game to game, but then how that might impact approachability. And then finally talks about our pets. And except for one person with a snake, the two of us on camera sadly do not have pets. And we, of course, talked about reviews and stuff. But for now, um, if you want to check me out, I am Stuff by Bez in all of the places. If you want to check me out, I am stuffbybez.com/streams. Tomorrow will be a super quick day. And I want to say thank you very much to everyone, but most importantly, thank you very much to Steve for being here.
Thank you.
And if people want to find you, where would you like to be found?
Yeah, so we are Tin Star Games, tin like the metal, tinstargames.com, tinstargames.itch.io, and Tin Star Games on Facebook, Tin Star Games on Instagram. We are Tin Star Games with a number 1 at the end on Twitter, and the Kickstarter is The Score. So just look for The Score RPG Kickstarter, and of course, Bez is lovely posting the link there as well. So please check that out. We've got all the info you need. You can print out the game, read the rules. We've tried to make it very accessible too. And one of the backing levels is just print and play, so you can get it and just make it as fancy as you like. And that's another way that we can make things very easily accessible and so on. So yeah, lots of options.
And with print and play, it's obviously then people are able to do the thing that works best for them. Those people who need bigger pieces could potentially even blow it up. Those people who need smaller pieces could theoretically shrink it down if they have that technical knowledge to change the size of an image.
Yeah, absolutely. That's probably a good idea. We could see if we could release it at the small card size. See if we can make a mini one for people to print. using that half side cards that they use in all those fantasy flight games. Yeah, that might be a fun thing to look at as an extra goal or something.
Well, I would like everyone to please, if you enjoyed this, share, spread the word. And I don't think there's anything left to say other than, or you could go the other way and have A4 size cards, sure.
Yep.
But lots of love, and of course, bye, bye,
Bye.
bye, bye. This is a goodbye song. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye, 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 bye. This is a goodbye song. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye, bye, everyone.